Welcome to this series exploring innovation, progress and achievement using a technocentric paradigm by Ash Stuart.
You may want to also read Ash's original Substack article for the best experience, including footnotes and other details.
Episode 33C1. The Golden Crescendo, the very architect of existence. The most extraordinary story of the roots of thought, being, and knowing. As described in episode 33C, in a fractal spin-off starting with this episode, I shall be covering the achievements of the greatest minds of a forgotten golden age of innovation and intellectual achievement, and making a case for why they matter to us in the modern day, how they shape the course of innovation and intellectual progress since their time to our own. Back in episode 23, I traced the emergence of systematic thought and intellectual inquiry, at least in Europe, looking at the Greeks of classical antiquity. Then in episode 30b, I traced how the Romans, or specifically one Marcus Tullius Cicero, carried forward this Greek baton alongside adding his embellishments to it. Also, just to complete the initial context, I'll recap the core development that after the fall of the Roman Empire in the West, despite efforts of people like Cicero, much of the ancient Greek knowledge was lost to the West, and that it was instead picked up by the Islamic scholars from about 750 onwards, as detailed in episode 33. I'll now be getting to the very heart of some of the core intellectual innovations that come next, building on top of the ancient Greek legacy. In other words, the very question of thought, of knowledge, reality, understanding. The underlying concepts can be represented in some rather daunting-looking technical terms. Close your eyes for a moment. Ontology, epistemology, metaphysics, and yes, philosophy. But trust me, as has been the case and commitment in my previous articles, there's absolutely no specialist knowledge or expertise required to follow along. And as before, you'll find the specifically technical detail in the copious footnotes. Follow me. The wellsprings of wisdom. I think it's fair to say that most of us have pondered over the nature of things. What is reality? How did everything come about? How can I know? How can I understand it? How can I be sure? When I trace the early intellectual development of the classical Greeks, back in episode 23, I made the case that the Greek genius was to discard random explanations and attempt something intellectually rigorous, what they called the love of wisdom, philosophy. And we all know that the two greatest figures in this Greek tradition were Plato and his successor, Aristotle. Massive as the groundwork laid by these two giants was, it did leave some very fundamental questions unaddressed. For example, how did anything come to be? Aristotle formulated his notion to explain eternal motion in the cosmos, a perfect, unchanging being that the celestial spheres desire and thus move toward. But this is about moving and not being, and this is the tip of the unfinished Aristotelian iceberg that the hero of our story decisively tackles after a gap of about 1,300 years. Prolific prowesses. So, introducing Abu Ali al-Hussein ibn Abdullah ibn al-Hasan ibn Ali ibn Sina al-Balkhi al-Bukhari. Or, catching my breath, just Ibn Sina, also known in the medieval Latin translations as Avicenna. I'll use either version. A Persian physicist, philosopher, active by the turn of the first millennium, and beyond these areas, having prolifically written on mathematics, physics, astronomy, alchemy, psychology, theology, geography and geology, and even poetry. A true polymath if there was one. Now, obviously, I cannot and will not be going to the detail of all of these endeavors of his here. It's hard enough to decide what's more daunting, his unpassport fillable full name or his unLinkedIn fittable list of expertises, right? So you can relax. I'll touch upon 3 foundational achievements of his in the field of thought and knowledge. I might share some of his poetry if you ask me nicely. Well, I can always have another fractal spin-off, eh? The being. So yes, the first question is, of course, the most fundamental. What is being? And by extension, how does anything come to be? For in some sense, everything proceeds from that. I shall refrain from quoting that overquoted Hamlet line yet again. The technical term for the study of being is ontology. Ibn Sina formulated a key conceptual framework for addressing this ontological conundrum. He suggested a fundamental distinction between essence and existence. He posited that the essence is the core concept, such as the essence of a horse is hoarseness, but that itself does not imply existence. Put another way, we can conceive the essence of things that do not and cannot exist, say, a unicorn. Go away, Silicon Valley VCs. Once I cover the other 2 key breakthroughs, we'll start to appreciate why this matters. The becoming. So that being his intellectual foundation for the very question of being, he was then able to formulate the question of becoming. With regard to the question of existence, he laid out 3 possibilities. Let's start with the easy one, impossible. This is, of course, easy to understand. A square circle, a married bachelor. Add your favorite oxymoron here. Quick Windows update, a brief meeting, sincere politician, whatever. The next category he suggested was contingent. Something may or may not exist. It's not a given. And this includes the vast majority of things, the planets, the trees, the animals, you, me. Think of all those How I Met Your Mother stories going the other way. And finally, Ibn Sina proposes one final category, the necessary. And within the framework of his theology, he posits that there is only one entity that comes under this category. To appreciate this, he lays out that for anything that has essence to attain existence, and remember, the impossibles are ruled out, there has to be this one entity that causes the existence of it. But how does this causal entity itself obtain existence? He says, uniquely, that one has both essence and existence, or in other words, has always existed without needing a cause, and that he calls God. The knowing. So the other important question that comes up, assuming you're still in the pub and pondering over a pint, is how do we know? How do we know anything? In technical terms, this is dealt by the field of epistemology, a term you've no doubt often seen me using in previous articles. So back to Aristotle, again for the baseline which Avicenna improved upon. Aristotle formulated the technique of the syllogism to derive at conclusions. In Aristotelian terms, its basic structure is a major premise and a minor premise, leading to a conclusion. In the Avicennian treatment of this, to answer the core epistemological question, a syllogism has the initial premises and the final conclusion. But the challenge is in finding the middle term, the one that connects the initials and the final, and thus makes for knowledge, Kappen. sort of from the known to the unknown, or from the seen to the understood, or observation to inference. On this basis, Avicenna then posited the need for what he called hads, what I translate as wit, in a deeper sense, or variously intuition or quick wit. And from there, he went on to suggest that different people have different levels of this wit, whereby some people can more easily find the middle term than others. Think Sherlock Holmes versus Dr. Watson, elementary. And he then went on to suggest that those rare few who have very high levels of this capability, such that they can find the middle terms and thus acquire knowledge with the least effort, again, within the framework of his theology, are the prophets.
A comprehensive system.
So yes, now to the question, what's the relevance of all this to us? Should we simply accept the positions and conclusions he makes? Well, that's not the objective here at all. This is about logic, not faith. In the first instance, the objective is for us to appreciate the logical rigor of his approach. Aristotle had been vague or at best somewhat implicit about any connection between what Avicenna neatly distinguishes as essence versus existence, and doing so, Ibn Sina established the concept of modality. Essences are neutral with respect to existence. They are possible in themselves, but contingent beings require an external cause to actualize their existence. And this allowed him to define his notion of God without resorting to circular logic or any form of recursion, confusing programming term. In saying there is only one necessary entity with both essence and existence baked in, it's as if, like we would say, the buck stops there. With the CEO, the chief existential officer, if you prefer. And again, with his framing of wit, there is an elegant simplicity of his argument. I'll come to the question of simplicity of arguments in 3 episodes from this one.
The lithesome Lego of logic.
Aristotle described motion and change, but Avicenna went on to explain being and becoming, far more fundamental. In other words, he demonstrated that these were questions not of physics, but of something meta, because physics essentially describes the reality as we can observe it. So yes, these existential questions are better handled by metaphysics. It's true that Avicenna's ontology, epistemology, and metaphysics, and thus his philosophy, are all rooted in Islamic theology and within the expectations of Islamic cosmology. How could that not be? He was part and product of the Islamic theological and intellectual movement, where monotheism and the prophet are uncompromisable tenets. To expect anything different is like expecting Shakespeare to go, "Ditch it, I'm going to write all my plays in Japanese." But here's the beauty of it. We can use his system, his overall framework, and apply it ways that make sense to us. For example, we can use the monistic concept of the One as that one entity which comes with both essence and existence baked in. Or we can find parallels to the concept of Brahman. In Indian, that is, Vedic and later Hindu philosophy, despite the partial caricatures of polytheism, which is defined as that one being from which everything in existence proceeds. I know, there is a supreme irony in being able to give many meanings to the one. I mean, even to this day, aren't scientists looking for that one unified theory that purportedly explains everything? Like using one simple equation starting with, let's say, to take a completely random example, E. For centuries after Avicenna, who lived around the turn of the first millennium, his work was the foundation and framework for much thought and discourse, not just in the Islamic world, but significantly also in the medieval and even early modern European scholastic and related fields, the most notable names being Thomas Aquinas and Duns Scotus. It was Avicenna who helped such medieval Christian theologians as these strengthen their own definition of their idea of God. In fact, they used the Avicennian framework to resolve purely Christian theological concerns such as the Trinity. It was Avicenna who helped the Europeans reconcile Aristotle with Christianity. But it doesn't stop there. Avicenna's work in the turn of the first millennium of our era, in these fields, and even more so in medicine, became canonical. His epistemology of awareness, based on his famous thought experiment of the flying man, anticipated René Descartes' well-known I think therefore I am by 6 centuries. Where classical philosophy achieved profound insights but remained largely unsystematized, Ibn Sina created the first comprehensive philosophical system, internally coherent, methodologically unified, and capable of addressing both theoretical and practical domains. This systematic approach, transmitted through Latin scholasticism and later Renaissance humanists, shaped modern thought, by some accounts became the model for modern philosophy itself. In this sense, Avicenna Ibn Sina stands as the most influential philosopher between Aristotle and Descartes, not merely preserving Greek thought, but genuinely advancing beyond it.